Hello, I'm Keith Hocton. I've always known that U2's Sunday Bloody Sunday, written back in 1982, had its roots in a grim day in Northern Ireland, a cold January afternoon in 1972 in the city of Derry. Tensions there had been building for years. Catholic nationalists were demanding civil rights, Protestants were backing continued British rule, and the British Army had been sent in to keep the peace. But peace was the one thing in short supply. On January the 30th, thousands turned out for what was meant to be a peaceful civil rights march. They were protesting internment without trial, a policy that let the British government arrest and imprison people indefinitely without ever charging them. The marchers wanted their voices heard. But as the procession wound its way through the bogside, soldiers from the 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment were sent in. What followed stunned the world. Soldiers opened fire on unarmed civilians. 13 people were killed outright. Another would later die of his injuries. Most of them were young men. Some were shot while running away, others as they tried to help the wounded. None of them had weapons. Television cameras captured everything. The images were shocking. Men gunned down as they fled, others falling with white handkerchiefs in their hands. The British government quickly launched an inquiry, but it largely cleared the soldiers. Almost no one in Ireland believed it. Because for nationalists, it was proof yet again that justice under British rule simply did not exist. And here's the thing, folks. Bloody Sunday changed the course of the conflict. Until then, the IRA was a small, faltering group. After that day, its ranks swelled. Young men who had never picked up a weapon before decided that peaceful protest was a dead end. The violence escalated, and the troubles grew even darker. It took nearly 40 years for the British state to admit the truth. In 2010, after the long Savile inquiry, Prime Minister David Cameron stood in Parliament and finally acknowledged that the killings were unjustified and unjustifiable. And I suppose that is the closest Britain has ever come to saying, we got it terribly wrong. So when U2 wrote Sunday Bloody Sunday in the early 1980s, the memory of that day in Derry was still very raw. They weren't writing a rebel anthem. What they were doing was actually capturing the grief, the horror, the futility, if you like, of it all. That pounding drumbeat, those stark lyrics, they don't glorify the fight, they mourn it. And that's what the song is really about. One Sunday in Derry, when unarmed civilians were shot down and Northern Ireland's conflict was driven to an even darker chapter. But here's the thing. The Bloody Sunday of 1972 wasn't the first, and it certainly wasn't the first time Britain had made a terrible mistake by killing innocent Irish civilians. Let me take you back to Dublin in 1920. This is from the Free Man's Journal, published on the 22nd of November of that year. The heading, Where Will It End? Yesterday morning, some 14 officers and men of the military and secret services were shot dead at the same hour in widely separated districts of the city, some in hotels, some in private residences. In the afternoon, the authorized answer of the government agents came in the form of an attack upon a football crowd assembled, unsuspecting of evil, to watch a football match in Croke Park. Croke Park was turned into Amritsar, with the difference that there were no proclamations, no warnings, no legalities defied by the assembly in Croke Park. The slaughter was a classic example of a government reprisal. The innocent were shot down in blind vengeance. The pretense that the firing was provoked by an attack upon the government forces will deceive no one in Ireland. It's yet another base official lie. Wow, strong words, aren't they? Remember, the Freeman's Journal wasn't some radical mouthpiece. It had long been the leading constitutional nationalist paper backing home rule rather than full independence. Yet here, you can actually hear the shock, the fury. even the possibility of a change of heart. And no wonder. The newspaper was describing events in Dublin the previous day, the day that has gone down in history as Ireland's first Bloody Sunday. It was probably the single most notorious moment in the War of Independence, which had begun nearly 2 years earlier. And it centers on what happened right there at Croke Park, this great shrine of Irish sport. But before I talk about the horror of that day, let me sketch the scene for you. The year is 1920. Sinn Féin had won a landslide election in December 1918. They'd set up a Republican counter-state with their own courts and their own officials. The Irish Volunteers had transformed themselves into the Irish Republican Army, committed to fighting for an independent republic. Guerrilla warfare was raging with ambushes and assassinations aimed at the British forces. And the British response? Reprisals. Harsh, bloody reprisals. The Royal Irish Constabulary, reinforced by the notorious Black and Tans, and the auxiliaries, struck back against civilians and rebels alike. Ireland was a land in turmoil. The violence was escalating on both sides. And into this febrile atmosphere came the events of that Sunday in November 1920 at Croke Park. An extraordinary day, and one that would actually stain the history of British rule in Ireland forever. The story of that day begins in the morning, and it begins with murder. At dawn on Sunday, the 21st of November, the IRA carried out one of their most audacious operations of the War of Independence. Their targets were agents of the British state. 14, maybe 15, depending on how they were counted. And it wasn't confined to Dublin, and it didn't end in the morning. By nightfall, there would be killings scattered across the entire country, civilians as well as combatants. In Waterford, a priest walking home from Mass, chatting to the grocer's daughter, was shot dead in the street. In Meath and Mayo, British forces fired on civilians. In Dublin, under curfew, another civilian was killed. All told, by the time the day was done, around 40 people lay dead. Now, 40 might not sound like an enormous number when compared to the great slaughters of history. That same year in India, at Amritsar, hundreds were massacred. But what happened in Dublin that Sunday was shocking not for its scale, but for its nature. Coordinated killings at dawn, a massacre in the afternoon, and the echoes of it would live in Irish history for generations. So let's walk through that day in detail. At around 9 o'clock in the morning, about 100 IRA men, led by the Dublin Brigade, fanned out across the city. They had a list of 19 men, 8 different addresses in the south inner city, plus one set of targets at the Gresham Hotel, directly across from the General Post Office. The operation was immaculately planned. The men had been identified through painstaking intelligence work by a special IRA unit known simply as the Squad. Michael Collins had created it in 1919, specifically to counter the work of the G Division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. The G men were detectives whose job was to hunt down Republicans, build cases against them, and then send them to prison, or, well, let's just see where the story goes. Collins's answer was brutal. Kill them before they could kill you. And on this November morning, his squad, bolstered by full-time fighters from Tipperary, moved in. 19 men were targeted. 15 were shot dead, 4 others wounded. A handful escaped entirely. But the message was absolutely clear. The British intelligence network in Dublin was fatally compromised, and these killings, make no mistake, had been personally ordered by Michael Collins himself. One of the gunmen that morning was a man named Stapleton. His target was Captain W.F. Newbury, who lived at 92 Lower Baggot Street. Stapleton and 2 others from the squad forced their way into Newbury's flat. Newbury was still in bed in his pajamas, his wife Hattie beside him. She was over from England, visiting her husband. When the squad burst in, Newbury panicked, trying to scramble out of the window to escape. Hattie threw herself in front of them and desperately tried to shield him. But it was of no use. Newbury was shot 7 times in the back as he tried to climb out. His body slumped and hung from the window frame, half in, half out. It took him 15 minutes to die. Hattie never left his side. She pulled a blanket over him, cradling him, whispering comfort as he bled out. Down on the street below, men passing by mocked him. Some even dipped their hands in his blood and washed them, laughing as they did so. So the question I had was Captain Newbury really the enemy the IRA claimed him to be, a secret agent? And I guess the evidence actually suggests yes, but it raises the bigger question. What was the reputation of British intelligence in Ireland at that point? Because let's be honest, up to now, I've been describing the British administration as hopelessly ineffective. But in one sense, their intelligence machine did matter. The great truth of Irish history is that nationalist and Republican groups were constantly riddled with informers. People who slipped information, sometimes accurate, mostly fabricated, to handlers in Dublin Castle. And many informers were just opportunists, making things up to impress the authorities to get paid. Remember, Ireland was in a depression, and like all secret services the world over, the British system often struggled to separate, good intelligence from fantasy. Even worse for them, Collins had infiltrated their system. The IRA was running its own double agents, feeding information back into British channels, creating a loop of false reports that came right back to Dublin Castle. I guess you could say it was a game of mirrors, and the British were constantly at risk of chasing shadows. Which brings us to the men who were shot that morning. According to the IRA, these were members of a so-called Cairo gang, a ruthless cabal of British intelligence agents who had to be eliminated for the survival of Irish Revolution. But here's the catch. Not all of those killed were intelligence officers, and remarkably, not all of them were even English. Some were spies, yes. Others, though, were not. And some may well have been killed in error. Take Henry Endless. He used the alias McMahon while operating in Dublin. He was an intelligence officer, and on the morning of the 21st, he was actually in bed with another agent, Joseph Connolly, who was from Wexford and had studied at University College Dublin. Both men were attacked by the IRA. So the shorthand version, the popular memory that Collins had 14 spies shot that morning, it's neat, it's dramatic, but it isn't entirely true. The reality, I think, is far murkier and far more unsettling. Not every man who died that morning was a spy, and that's where the story becomes more complicated, a little bit more unsettling. Take Ash Mains. The day he was killed, the New York Times ran a notice of his engagement to a New York socialite. A day later, the paper carried his death notice. Spy or not, his life was a mixture of privilege and tragedy, and it ended very abruptly in Dublin. Take Jack Fitzgerald. He'd only just joined the police. He came from a proud GAA family in Tipperary, one of 11 children, his father a patron of the local club. His mother had died young, and Jack had gone to Blackrock College, then enlisted in the British Army in 1915 when he was just 16 years old. And as so many young Irishmen did, he fought with the 16th Division, he saw very heavy action, then he joined the Royal Flying Corps in 1917. His plane crashed, he was captured, he escaped, he was recaptured. I mean, what a story. After the war, he was demobbed in 1919, and with a restless energy, he signed up for the colonial police. He was due to ship overseas on the 5th of December, but on the 21st of November, he was still in Dublin, lying in bed, when he was shot dead. And I think his story makes clear that not all the victims that morning were intelligence operatives. At 117 Morehampton Road, another target was gunned down. But this man wasn't a spy either. He was actually the landlord of the house, mistaken for an agent, or perhaps killed because of some private grudge that he had with Collins. We'll never really know. Then there's the remarkable case of Paddy McCormick from Mayo. Educated at Castle Knock College, he had first made a name as a jockey, winning races all across Ireland before moving on to become a very, very successful trainer and a qualified vet. And he actually served in the Army Veterinary Corps during the war. And he was based in Egypt. And afterwards, he actually secured a post running horse racing in Cairo. And he was preparing to move there with his wife and 4-year-old daughter, Grace. McCormick was staying at the Gresham Hotel. He lived flamboyantly, rising only in the late afternoon unless there was racing, hosting lavish entertainments. He and his wife loved to party. On the 21st of November, he was shot and left to die in a pool of blood in his hotel room. Now, here's an irony. The group of agents killed that morning came to be known as the Cairo Gang. The name supposedly tied to the colonial service, hardened veterans of empire. But McCormick, who was actually going to Cairo to work to organize horse racing, he had nothing to do with intelligence work at all. It was just a pure coincidence. And myth is what this day quickly became. The shortened version, repeated for decades, is that Collins had 15 spies shot. But that simply isn't true. Some were spies, yes. Some were officers, some were police recruits, some were civilians. War is incredibly messy, and the mythology of the Irish Revolution, I think it often glosses over that fact. And Michael Collins? Well, he himself was unflinching about what he ordered. He later wrote, "My plan was the destruction of the undesirables who made miserable the lives of ordinary decent citizens. If I had a second motive, it was no more than a feeling such as I would have for a dangerous reptile. By the destruction, the very air is made sweeter. There is no crime in detecting or destroying in wartime a spy or an informer. I paid them back in their own coin." That language, spies as reptiles, killing as cleansing the air, it's the rhetoric that we hear again and again in paramilitary conflicts. And it has sunk deep, I think, into the nationalist mythology. But it's a mythology that obscures the harder truth. Among the dead were not just spies, but civilians. And of course, then there's the toll that it actually took on the killers themselves. We've already heard the chilling details. Men shot in their beds in front of their wives, in front of their children. One gunman was actually seen laughing as he washed his hands in the victim's blood. But others were broken by what they'd done. James Norton was one of Collins's men. He shot 3 British intelligence officers that morning, killing 2, wounding another, all in front of their families. Afterwards, very soon afterwards, his health collapsed. He drank heavily. He slid into despair. And by July 1921, suffered complete mental breakdown. And he spent the rest of his life in Grange Gorman Mental Hospital in Dublin. Because here's the truth, folks. It's one thing to romanticize dying for Ireland. It's quite another to live with the memory of actually killing another human being. A man in his pajamas, a wife sobbing at his side, a child screaming in terror. That's not the stuff of myth. Killing a spy may have been an order, even a duty, but it's a very different thing when you actually see a man in his pajamas clinging to that wife terrified. I don't think that image ever leaves you. That's the thing about war in Ireland. Many of these young men weren't trained soldiers. For some, pulling the trigger that morning was the very first time they'd ever fired a gun. And it was in their own neighborhood, against a man that they would have walked past on the street the day before. No wonder it scarred them. And yet, while all this was unfolding, Dublin's daily life carried on. The city still had its rhythms, and sport, of course, was very much a large part of that rhythm. On the very day of the shootings, a big match was scheduled at Croke Park. Tipperary, a county much better known for hurling than football, had a brilliant Gaelic football team in 1920. and a challenge match had been set up against Dublin. By the afternoon, it was as though the bloodletting of the morning had been sealed off in another world. Crowds were coming in from all over the city to the stadium, as if Dublin wasn't a city at war. And for many people, after all, it didn't feel like war had actually touched them directly. There were actually 2 games scheduled that day. First, a local club match, and during that, the GAA, or the Gaelic Athletic Association's administrators, were meeting in the stands, setting out their plans for the months ahead. It was then that officers of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA turned up, and they warned that the match should be cancelled, that there were whispers that the British might come to the ground looking for people. But cancelling the game was dangerous too. The GAA leadership worried that calling it off would look like an admission of guilt, like they were complicit in the assassinations that morning. Besides, by that point, a large crowd had already gathered. Thousands had paid for their tickets, and that money, ironically, was earmarked to go straight to the Republican cause. So the gates stayed open. Just after 2 o'clock, the turnstiles were moving, the stewards were in place, tickets were being sold, and by the time the ball was thrown at 3:15, there were about 5,000 spectators inside Croke Park. 5,000 people there for a Sunday game of football, blissfully unaware that the day's violence was far from over. Ash Shoulders, who'd once won the All-Ireland Football Championship for Dublin, was now an IRA man and a leading GAA official. And he was there that afternoon and later gave one of the clearest eyewitness accounts of what took place. The match had started when a plane flew over the ground, and to a lot of people that plane was the signal. It was either signaling that the game was on or spotting for the security forces, or both. And the plane is one of those details that gets tangled up in myth, and it's hard to separate the stories from the precise facts. Yes, there was indeed a plane, and it was scouting. Exactly how its observations were used, whether it radioed or signaled to troops below, well, that remains unclear, and there's nothing in the records. What we do know is this: 15 minutes after the ball was thrown in, at about 3:30 in the afternoon, lorries, trucks for my American listeners, carrying regiments of the British Army and detachments of the police, arrived outside the ground and immediately began firing into the crowd. So why did they come? The administrators in Dublin Castle were convinced that the GAA was a hotbed of nationalist organising and that its matches were being used to move people in and out of the city, and also perhaps, I suppose, to harbour men involved in the morning's operations. That morning's operations. That allegation, I think, was exaggerated in places, but it wasn't entirely without foundation. There were, after all, people in the crowd who had been connected to events earlier that day. Add to that the shock and fury in the security services. They had lost colleagues. They had been humiliated. There was an urgent desire to respond, to show action, to show strength. In that atmosphere of outrage, an order came from Dublin Castle permitting a raid on Croke Park to search for men and arms. The plan, broadly sketched, was to approach the ground from 3 directions and sweep the stands. It sounds almost impossible now to imagine troops firing on a football match, but that is how the minutes of that day escalated. What began as an ordinary Sunday crowd arriving to watch a good game found themselves in the path of a state which, you have to say, in fury and fear, decided to make an instant and brutal demonstration of force. Today, Croke Park can hold almost 83,000 people. But back in 1920, it was nothing like the vast arena that we now know. It was a smaller ground, hemmed in by rows of terraced houses and laneways woven into the fabric of the city rather than towering above it. On that Sunday, the plan was simple. 3 groups of men would surround it. The first came down Russell Street past the Modern Gills pub and stopped at the bridge on Jones's Road. near where the Hogan stand and the Davin stand now today. These were the Black and Tans, ex-soldiers recruited into the RIC, notorious for their brutality. They were commanded by Major E.J. Mills, and their job was to seal the entrance at the canal end. The second group were auxiliaries, the dreaded ADRIC, made up of former British officers and even more feared than the Tans. These were soldiers from the Duke of Wellington's regiment under Lieutenant Robert Bray. They took the position at the opposite end, behind what is now the modern Cusack Terrace. The third group of troops blocked the last gate and entrance into St. James's Avenue. In theory, you'd have to say it was watertight. All the exits were sealed. The crowd would eventually be funneled out and searched one by one. Any guns would be seized, and any wanted men taken into custody. That's the plan. A stop-and-search operation. Containment, not carnage. But that's not how it happened. The first to die was an 11-year-old boy, William Robinson. He was perched in a tree, watching the match as boys always did, when a bullet struck him. He fell instantly to the ground, dead. Nearby, 10-year-old Jerome O'Leary was sitting on a wall cheering on the play when a shot went straight through his head. He too was killed where he sat. At the far end of the ground, between Croke Park and the railway, another boy, Billy Scott, was struck by a bullet that ricocheted off a building. He also died instantly. 3 children gone in moments. The police and the Black and Tans poured through the corner entrance by the bridge, firing wildly. And you might think at some point that they'd stop, that someone would realize what was happening. But they didn't. They pressed on, consumed by a blood-filled rage, firing indiscriminately into the crowd. Panic set in. The crowd of thousands turned into a stampede. People screamed and surged, desperate to escape. At the opposite end, soldiers hearing the firing opened up themselves, shooting at fleeing spectators. It was chaos, sheer hell. People running in all directions, diving for cover, paralyzed by terror. Some were shot down, others were trampled in the crush. Hundreds were injured as they clawed at the exits, only to be caught on barbed wire strung across the walls. Wire that had been put there to stop people sneaking in for free now trapped them inside. Jane Boyle was killed, shot and then crushed by the fleeing crowd. James Burke and James Tehan were trampled to death. Daniel Carroll managed to get out of the stadium itself, but a ricocheted bullet caught him and he died of his wounds later in a nearby house. And all the while, inside Croke Park, many remained trapped. The firing did eventually stop, but rifles and even machine guns stayed trained on the terrified crowd. Survivors were kept penned in with the dead and the dying for over an hour before being searched on their way out. But then the ground was a scene of utter devastation. Bodies lying still on the grass, families weeping over their dead, survivors stumbling past the wreckage of what should have been a Sunday afternoon of football. That was the first Bloody Sunday, 21st of November 1920. And in a moment, I'll come back to talk about some of the people who were killed, the aftermath of the shooting, and how this massacre shaped the War of Independence, and how in the end, it pushed Ireland down the path to the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So take a breath. I'll return after the break. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. I've already painted in harrowing detail the scenes at Croke Park. Eventually, of course, the ground emptied, though the memory of that day would never leave it. And I'll come back to the inquiries, the cover ups, and the attempts by the authorities to justify what happened. But for now, I think there are two things worth stressing. First, the morning and the afternoon are inextricably linked. The massacre at Croke Park was a direct response to the assassinations carried out by the IRA earlier that day. That was the rhythm of the war by 1920. Reprisals had become almost institutionalized. The pattern was clear. Every IRA operation would be answered by British retaliation. But never before had it happened on this scale. And second, people often describe the killings in Croke Park as cold-blooded. I actually don't believe that. I don't think they were calculated executions. I think what happened was hot-blooded, an eruption of fear. The soldiers and the police were out of control, consumed by fury and by fear, stripped of reason. And that loss of reason was fueled by the way many British officials and soldiers viewed the Irish as lesser, as suspect, as an enemy population rather than fellow citizens. The perception shaped the nature of the violence. Among those who died that day, one name is remembered above all others: Michael Hogan. He was a player for Tipperary. From South Tipperary originally, he was the only footballer that was killed. He died crawling off the pitch near Hill 16. Today, one of Croke Park's great stands bears his name. Interestingly, his brother Dan was a leading IRA officer in Moynihan, and Michael himself had actually been an IRA company commander back home while working the family farm. But there's absolutely no suggestion that he was deliberately targeted. He was simply caught, like so many others, in the storm of bullets. Hogan's death was seared into the memory because he was on the pitch, because he was a symbol of Irish sport itself. But that had me wondering, well, what about the others? What about the others whose names didn't carry the same weight? Take Michael Fury. He was 40, a labourer, living in the slums just behind Buckingham Street, not far from Croke Park. He actually managed to escape the stadium after being shot, but collapsed on Russell Street, bleeding so badly that he actually just died there in the street. His body lay unclaimed in a Dublin morgue for 5 days. When a British Army officer eventually examined him, he noted that Fury was malnourished. Several teeth were missing, clothed in old fatigues and worn-down army boots. Those boots told their own story. Fury had fought for Britain in the Great War, like so many other Irishmen of his generation. By 1920, he was unemployed, struggling to survive in a city still scarred by poverty and war. Michael Hogan has a stand named after him, and I think rightly so, but Michael Fury's life was no less valuable. Both men, a farmer's son from Tipperary and a poor labourer from Dublin's slums, I think they remind us of the sheer randomness and human tragedy of what happened on that particular day. And keep in mind, the killings at Croke Park weren't the end of Bloody Sunday. That night, more blood was spilled. Inside Dublin Castle, two veterans of the 1916 Uprising, Patrick Clancy and Richard McKee, both key figures in the IRA, both central to the planning of that morning's assassinations, were shot dead. Alongside them was Conor Clune, an Irish language activist and co-op manager from County Clare. Clune actually had nothing to do with the revolution. He had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, arrested in error the night before. And the official version claimed that all three were trying to escape around 11 o'clock that night. But let's be honest, the story collapses under the slightest scrutiny. Clune had no reason to escape, and when their bodies were recovered, the truth was fairly obvious. They had been beaten beyond recognition and then executed. For the Dublin IRA, the loss of McKee and Clancy was devastating. One of their comrades later said it knocked all the good out of it. And the truth is, those two men were more valuable to Collins's intelligence network than all the agents killed that morning. When Ireland finally won independence, their names lived on. 2 army barracks were christened in their memory. But Bloody Sunday echoes carried far beyond Dublin. The very next morning, IRA operatives torched the docks at Liverpool. And the war wasn't confined to Ireland. There were cells active in England engaged in sabotage. There was even a plot to poison the household cavalry's horses to disrupt the state opening of Parliament. 3 months later, in Manchester, IRA volunteers were caught attempting to burn down Old Trafford, home of Manchester United. Of course, they failed, but they did succeed in torching a stand at Manchester City's ground. And I had to ask myself, was that a targeted sporting reprisal for Croke Park? Don't know. It's hard to say, but the symbolism is rather striking. And then there was the political fallout. Outrage, of course, ran hot across Ireland. But in England, too, there was shock, particularly among liberal opinion, which had been very uneasy with the escalating violence already. You know, the massacre at Croke Park made headlines and raised very difficult questions about Britain's conduct in Ireland. The government's response was very predictable, I have to say. They denied everything. In the House of Commons, Sir Hammer Greenwood, the Chief Secretary of Ireland, the most senior British official in the country, stood up and insisted that the first shots at Croke Park had come from inside the ground. He claimed that 30 revolvers had been found afterwards. He even argued that it wasn't the bullets that killed people at all, it was the stampede that followed. According to Greenwood, the victims had been crushed in the panic and not gunned down in cold blood. It was, of course, a complete lie, but I think it shows you the scale of the outcry that Greenwood felt compelled to dress up the truth for Parliament, for the British press, and for the wider world. Greenwood told Parliament that the British forces had only opened fire because they themselves had been fired on. There were gunmen in the crowd who then tried to escape. He said he deeply regretted the loss of life, but insisted that the responsibility lay entirely with the IRA. And as it so often happens, conservative newspapers in Britain backed up the story and they ran with it. Yet not everyone was fooled. The Guardian dismissed the claim as nonsense, and the Labour Party in Britain even sent its own commission to Dublin. Their report found no evidence whatsoever that the police had been fired upon, and instead condemned what it called the calculated brutality and lack of self-control of the forces of the Crown. But for decades afterwards, the truth was locked away. 67 years, the courts of inquiry and military records were kept from public view. Then, in 1999, the historian David Leeson, he unearthed them, and among them was a report written by Major Mills, the very man who had commanded the Black and Tans at Croke Park, and also the reports from 2 military courts of inquiry at the Mater Hospital and the other at Jarvis Street. The documents were absolutely damning. Mills himself admitted that no arms had been found in the searches. The courts of inquiry made it clear there had been no gun battle. The official version of events, that Croke Park had been some kind of shootout, was a show, beyond doubt, and complete fiction. So, how do we understand Croke Park? It becomes one of the foundational moments in modern Irish history, a wound that never quite heals. For nationalists, for the GAA, for Irish sport itself, the massacre was seared into memory. You know, many of us still remember the scenes when the England rugby team finally played there in 2007 for the first time. You know, the emotion that day was palatable. The roar of the Irish fans in a stadium once tainted with blood is unforgettable. But I think the true meaning of Bloody Sunday doesn't lie in the headlines or even the grand narratives of history. I just don't think it does. It lies in the personal pain of the people left behind. Think of Jerome O'Leary, forced to go to the Mater Hospital and identify the body of his 10-year-old son. When he was asked by a reporter to describe him, he simply said, he was a schoolboy. Think of Bridget Robinson, just 29 years old, walking across Dublin that same Sunday evening from her home in Little Britain Street to the Drumcordia Hospital. Her son William, 11 years old, had been shot through the chest. He clung on for hours before dying. She had to stand there, a young mother, and watch. And think also of her husband, Patrick Robinson. He was a surgeon at that very same hospital, fighting in vain to save his own son's life. What words could possibly capture that man's grief? These, for me, are the truths that sit beneath the politics, beneath the propaganda. The real meaning of Bloody Sunday lies in the grief of families, the loss of children, the knowledge that lives were ended in a moment of complete madness, and that for decades afterwards, the world was told lies about what happened. Think too of James Boyle, left to mourn his sister Jane, 26 years old, killed in the crush at Croke Park. Or Annie Burke, who came in from Windy Arbor to testify about the death of her husband. Her words were devastating in their simplicity. He left on Sunday to see a football match at 2:00, and that's it. Those families, the Boyles, the Burkes, the McCormacks, the O'Learys, the Robinsons, were united in grief. Their blood and the blood of their loved ones was spilled across Dublin that Sunday, in private houses at dawn, on the grass of Croke Park in the afternoon, and in the cells of Dublin Castle late that night. People often talk about blood sacrifice in the language of Irish nationalism. But you know what? The real legacy of Bloody Sunday actually lies in the blood of the ordinary families, a loss that can never be recovered. And part of the horror is precisely that Croke Park was a leisure space. It was a football ground, a place for families, for sport, for joy. You know, what happened there tore away any illusion that civilians were somehow now shielded from the war. And I think that's why the story still resonates so deeply. It revealed the conflict's sheer brutality and how, by late 1920, Ireland had descended into a much darker, nastier place. Within a week of Croke Park came the Kilmichael ambush in County Cork, where 17 auxiliaries were killed, the worst single defeat that Britain suffered during the war. A month later, another auxiliary was killed at Dillon's Cross, and in reprisal, and I find this staggering, the Crown forces burned down Cork's City Hall and its Carnegie Library. These were the headline reprisals, the ones that burned themselves into memory. But, you know, across Ireland, there were countless smaller ones. Farmers came to their fields to find their livestock shot dead. Creameries, you know, the beating heart of rural life, vital to the Irish economy, were torched. Crown forces, often bored, angry, or simply incapable of countering guerrilla warfare, lashed out by destroying property, killing animals, and punishing communities. And of course, the war got uglier. Violence beget violence. On both sides, there was a brutalization underway. You know, Bloody Sunday was the most notorious moment, but it was part of a wider pattern of atrocity and reprisal. And for Britain, it was a propaganda catastrophe. Abroad, the stories of Cork burning, of children being killed at Croke Park, painted an image of a state out of control, heavy-handed, brutal. British credibility in the court of world opinion was completely shredded. And yet, you know, here's the paradox. On the ground, and by late 1920 and into 1921, the British had in some ways stabilized the situation. You know, the IRA were feeling the strain for sure. And by May 1921, it's reckoned that the IRA had about 5,000 men, with maybe 3,000 rifles and close to 5,000 revolvers. Ammunition, though, was desperately short. Money was tight, supplies were scarce, but the guerrilla campaign was still deadly, but it was also running close to exhaustion. The war was changing. The IRA were bloodied but not unbowed. The British were still standing, but their reputation abroad was in tatters, and Ireland was being dragged inch by bloody inch towards a settlement. By the summer of 1921, the war was reaching a kind of grinding stalemate. The IRA still had bite for sure. In the 10 days before the truce was declared in July, no fewer than 17 policemen were killed. There was still capacity, still will, still blood being shed. But the British government, in turn, was hammering back with reprisals. Not always a clear policy, not with any real plan for ending the conflict, but just with sheer force. And yet they knew they couldn't simply win it militarily. To do that would have meant sending in vast numbers of troops, holding Ireland down for years at a huge cost. And the will and the money just weren't there. And by now, even the British High Command was starting to wonder if they were losing control. And it felt like a war that neither side could win outright, but neither side could escape either. The Customs House attack in May 1921, I think, best illustrates that point. The IRA struck at the very heart of the British administration in Dublin, burning the building to the ground. And on the surface, it looked like a propaganda coup, a dramatic blow against British rule. But it came at a terrible cost. Roughly 100 volunteers were captured and many more were killed. Guns were lost that couldn't be replaced. And it was exactly the kind of set-piece battle that the IRA had sworn they would never fight. And of course, it was an absolute disaster. For all the spectacle, it showed the limits of their strengths. The reality was that the IRA could not defeat Britain militarily, but what they had done, and I think this is crucial, was to destroy the legitimacy of the British state across huge swathes of the country. By 1921, British rule in Ireland had become rule by reprisal. Arson, shootings, collective punishment, and legitimacy, once lost, well, it's very hard to win back. That recognition was slowly dawning in London too. By early 1921, ministers were beginning to accept that a new policy was needed. A policy not based solely on force. There had been tentative attempts at peace before. At the end of 1920, Lloyd George had sent over new figures to Dublin, men like Andy Cope and Sir John Anderson, to try to recalibrate, British policy. There were feelers put out through intermediaries like businessman Patrick Moylett, but those efforts collapsed, not least because of the anger and the bitterness left in the wake of Bloody Sunday. Even Archbishop Patrick Clune of Perth, the uncle of poor Conor Clune, who had been shot in Dublin Castle that same day, tried to broker a deal. But even his intervention came to nothing. By 1921, the circumstances were shifting. The Government of Ireland Act had been passed in late 1920, petitioning the island and laying the groundwork for Northern Ireland's Parliament. That, combined with the bloody stalemate on the ground, created the space for serious talks. And so, after months of bloodshed, reprisals, and failed approaches, the ground was finally being prepared for what would become the Truce of July 1921. In June 1921, King George V travelled to Belfast to open the new Northern Ireland Parliament. And on the surface, it was ceremony. But the words he spoke that day, oh my gosh. Crafted by Jan Smuts, approved by Lloyd George, they were to call an end to the strife. The king asked all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, forgive and forget, and join in the making for the land they love a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill. For Lloyd George, I think it was a bit of a cover. Within his cabinet, there were still voices saying that there must be no talks, no compromises, that the IRA were just thugs to be crushed. But the king's words legitimized negotiation. And from that moment came the path to peace. The Anglo-Irish Treaty followed. I have to say, it would never have happened without King George V. It gave Ireland the Free State, self-government for the first time, a status, if you like Canada or Australia. But it came with conditions. The oath of allegiance to the Crown, intolerable for many Republicans, partition with Northern Ireland opting out immediately. Britain's grip on key naval bases, however, lasted until 1938. For some, I think it was a stepping stone to independence. For others, it was a betrayal. And the division ran so deep it split comrades apart and erupted into the Civil War of 1922. Brother against brother, men who had fought together now killing one another. So the treaty ended one war, but it began another. It gave Ireland its freedom for sure, but it left scars of partition, of civil conflict, of bitterness, scars that would endure for generations. And I think this is why Bloody Sunday, whether in Dublin in 1920 or Derry in 1972, still resonates. It's not only the story of political struggle or even of treaties and parliaments. It's the story of families broken, of children lost, of blood spilled on football pitches and city streets. It's a story of lies told by governments, of cover-ups, and of truths only acknowledged decades too late. Which I guess brings me back to U2. You know, when Bono stood on stage and sang Suddy Bloody Sunday, he wasn't writing a rebel anthem. He was giving voice to grief, to rage, to futility. The pounding drums are not a call to arms. They're just not. They're a lament for boys shot out of trees in Croke Park, for unarmed men gunned down in Derry, and for all the ordinary lives destroyed by conflict. And I think that's why the song still matters, why it still resonates, because long after the treaties are signed and history books are written, the memory of Bloody Sunday, both Bloody Sundays, reminds us of the true cost of war. And the echo of those words, "How long must we sing this song?" still haunts the Irish story today. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.